without further ado, Dr. Chris Thornberg. You got it.
Good evening. Oh, you really? That's what you're going to do to me? You give me. One more time. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. This morning I started out giving a talk for the Riverside Development Agency, or the Office of Economic Development, I think they call themselves. So perfect to end up, of course, in Fresno, same sort of organization, doing the same sort of strong work, really at a ground level, helping people understand what's going on. And what I'm going to do today is add to that conversation. That a lot of great information in this book, but I want to put, of course, a bigger picture on it. And while I'm at it, there's something else I'm going to talk about, which is the difference between economic realities and the stories we tend to tell ourselves about the economy, because that becomes a critical component in what I'm going to talk about tonight. So let's just kick right into it. Recession. You just heard, of course, some comments about how the world has changed in 12 months. There is a lot of consternation. Actually, the consternation isn't relatively new. Some of these headlines started over a year ago. Started with a little bit of that slow growth in the beginning of 2022, and suddenly, boom, prediction after prediction. Americans going to have problems. Jamie Dimon is talking about economic hurricanes. We have a 98% chance of a global recession, and it goes on and on and on and on. Now, what's interesting about this, take, for example, Zandy. Zandy called for a full-blown market correction, which, by the way, I'm pretty sure Zandy has called for every single year for the last, 15 years or so, right? Some point in time he's going to be right, which brings me to, I think, the broader conversation here. Before you start getting all worried about these dismal headlines, have you not sort of noticed that dismal headlines are the rule, not the exception? Remember 2019, when we were also about to fall into recession? Now, back then, of course, it was stories about the Chinese trade war and the rise in interest rates, perhaps a different set of causes, but the same incredibly negative headlines. And if you'd gone a couple of years before that, there was a similar set of negative headlines, and so on and so forth. If you add it all up, what we've seen in our economy over the last decade is what I call, well, miserableism. Miserableism is the philosophy of pessimism. It's basically, no matter what I put in front of you, no matter how good the news is, the miserablest job is to figure out how to tell you it's bad, right? And that's everything that's going on nowadays, and it's consistent. And that brings me, I think, to the broader point, which is beware the narrative. Now, it's funny, back in the day, I started my career, Beacon Economics, in 2006 when I left UCLA because I had a weird idea. I said, real estate, I think, is a bubble and it's going to cause a recession. And back then, I earned the term Dr. Doom for my prognosis of what was going to happen to the economy. But since then, I haven't been feeling that way at all. In fact, over the last decade, I have felt like the constant optimist in the room, which is weird because I haven't changed, but something else has. And what's changed, of course, is the narrative. And I use the term the narrative because, well, again, going back to miserableism, I saw the miserableism, but the miserableism made me nervous. Look, I have a PhD in economics. I got it from UCLA, which they call Chicago West. And the first thing we learned was about the rational agent at the heart of all our models. And that rational agent, homo economist, takes into account available information and makes the appropriate decisions. So in that world, we don't have to think about the story. We don't have to pay attention to the headlines. The data is sufficient because in my world, the agent follows the data. But when you're in the real world and you're looking at the headlines, you're like, yeah, it's not really what's going on here. There's something fundamentally wrong. I called it miserableism. But then a couple of years ago, Robert Shiller, a guy who's a little bit smarter than me, I think, wrote a book called Narrative Economics. Now, if Robert Shiller sounds familiar, you might remember back in the day he wrote a wonderful book called Irrational Exuberance about .com. And between that book and this book, he also won the Nobel Prize in Economics. So he's a bright guy, to say the least. And this book, in Narrative Economics, he points out something. It's a great read. You can get it off Amazon for about $14. But the point of the book is really a critique of economics. And he says to economists, he goes, what are you talking about? How can you ignore the narrative? Look, this idea that people follow data is ridiculous. Data is something we've had 100, 150 years. People don't have spreadsheets in their head. What do we have in our head? Stories. You look at our understanding of human beings and our cultures and our creation of these fabulous, intricate societies, and they all boil down to one thing. Human beings are bonded by the stories that pull us together. And these stories are a fundamental part of human nature, of human culture. And by the way, the idea that these stories are somehow linked to reality, well, think of the many stories you've heard in your life, and you start to realize that's not true. Now, here's the key of all this. In this world of Chicago economists, when the narrative and the reality are overlapping, things are fine. This is a good world, because in this world, households make the right decisions. Businesses invest in the right places. Policymakers are pursuing the right goals. But this is not necessarily always that world. In fact, very often we find a world where the narrative and the reality become disjointed. And this is when you have to start watching out. Because it's when the narrative suddenly becomes disengaged from reality that households do dumb things, businesses do dumb things, and policymakers pursue the wrong goals. This is when things get interesting. And I don't mean interesting, of course, in a positive way. Now, how does this kind of bring us to where we are right now? Well, I appreciate the negative signals we've seen in our economy. Obviously, overall inflation picked up last year pretty sharply. University of Michigan consumer confidence plummeted. For those of you into numerology, of course, you know that the yield curve is inverted. That's when, of course, long-run interest rates are below short-run interest rates. And yes, we have the problems in the banking system, of course, as shown by the failure of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. But before you take this into heart too much, let's also take a step back and recognize something else, that this economy is not in a recession right now. I mean, we started this year with a 3.4% unemployment rate in January. 3.4%. The last time the unemployment rate was 3.4% in the United States was in 1968. Industrial production still remains near an all-time high level. We haven't gotten the cumulative numbers yet for GDP, but they look like they're coming in a little bit over 2%, which means, yet again, a third quarter in a row of good, decent economic growth. If this is a recession, well, long live the recession, okay? Because things look pretty good. So what's going on? Well, the narrative is very simple. Right off the bat, we have to remember that the economy is already in a crisis. Now, what crisis is that? I guess it depends on what party you belong to. One party will tell you it's a whole bunch of things, and the other party will tell you it's a whole bunch of other things. But they're all convinced the economy is already in a crisis. Then you have to add, of course, to it the two big news stories of 2022, obviously the big increase in inflation and the subsequent increase in interest rates. Story yet again, very simple. Inflation is killing the consumer. Interest rates is killing the real estate industry. And, of course, the failure of the Signature and Silicon Valley banks was just the tip of the iceberg, showing the rot in the system. No, not really. The reality is there's no reason for this economy to have a recession over the next 2 years. There's just no reason for it. But what about inflation and interest rates? Inflation and interest rates are not negative shocks to the economy. Inflation and interest rates are the consequences of the policies our policymakers have pursued over the last couple of years, namely the Federal Reserve violently overreacting to the pandemic and, of course, pumping way too much money into the economy. These aren't negative shocks to the economy. These are just the natural consequence of what happens when you increase the money supply by 45%. That's just how it works. If you think we're going to have a recession, the question I ask for all the pessimists out there is why? Where is this giant imbalance that you think is going to snap and cause all sorts of problems in our economy? It's not there, at least not yet. I just don't see it. Now, don't get me wrong. You're in real estate, and you all have to appreciate that when mortgage rates go from 2.5% up to 7%, well, it's going to be a little painful in the real estate world. Couldn't agree more. But that's not the big part of the cycle. Look, the 800-pound gorilla in the U.S. economy is the consumer. And by the way, for all the scary stories about consumers, here's the reality of consumers and consumer spending. They're doing great. And as long as they continue to do well, the rest of the economy will continue to function, which means, well, real estate's got to figure it out, and there's a lot of figuring out to do. At the back end, it doesn't matter for the overall economy as long as consumers continue to do what they do. In other words, you're going to have to figure it out even as the underlying economy continues to grow. Now, does that mean everything's fine? And the answer is no, absolutely not. There's a couple big problems. For example, one of the problems is when you take mortgage rates and you go from 2.5% to 7%, you cause a collapse in what we call filtering, which is the way housing markets deliver housing. You build at the top to build supply at the bottom. But that all depends on people moving up, and if people aren't moving up because they got a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage at 2.75%, well, filtering's just come to an end, and housing shortages will get worse. Labor shortages are an enormous issue across this entire nation, yet we haven't really truly come to grips with why we have these labor shortages and what exactly we're going to do about it from a long-run standpoint. We have public deficit challenges at the state and the federal level. We have a potential and completely pointless bank crisis on our hands. And then last but not least, the narrative. Because I'd love to tell you that, wow, the narrative's starting to reconverge to reality. It's not. The narrative remains incredibly off base from reality. And as a result of that, we continue to pursue solutions to problems that don't exist while we ignore the problems that do. And ultimately, that's not going to get us to where we need to be. But at least in the short run, it probably won't cause a recession. So, with all that, how did I get into this, and how did I come to these very odd beliefs in my world of forecasting? Oh, by the way, before I get into this, I should point out, at the very end of this presentation, there's a QR code. A lot of data here. I'm going to rip through it real quick. Don't get panicked. You can get the QR code at the end, and we'll get a copy of the presentation. You can go through the data yourself, okay? It's all sorts of federal and local stuff in it. Of course, the story all goes back to the pandemic. And look, the pandemic was clearly a truly tragic situation. 7 million people died. We were locked away in the house for a year. A whole generation of kids lost a year of education. Not good. But we took, of course, the pity party a little far, particularly when it came to these kind of conversations about the economy. This is in 2020. Just look at a few of these headlines. Leading economist warns of 10 years of depression and debt. That was Nouriel Roubini, by the way. Yes, by Zandi, called for a full-blown housing meltdown. Prices are going to fall. Make no mistake, this has morphed into a depression-like crisis, says my former colleagues at the UCLA forecast. Depression. No, it was never a depression-like crisis. It was never anything close to it. It was a different kind of shock to the system, and one that really didn't have long-run consequences. And the reality can be seen in the data. This was the deepest recession our nation has ever been faced with. There's no doubt about it. We had a 30% decline in GDP in one quarter. By the way, it was the shortest recession in the history of the United States because it ended in about 8 weeks. The economy was growing tremendously by the third quarter, and by 2021, we were out of it. It was an incredibly short cycle. But don't let reality intrude on a good narrative. Congress went to town like nobody's business. $6 trillion of stimulus. $6 trillion of deficit stimulus poured into the economy. By the way, how did they do that? Oh, a little context is helpful here. $6 trillion. Excuse me, I've got a little cough. The pandemic recession cost the U.S. economy about $1.2 trillion in economic output. The Congress used $6 trillion in deficit spending. For every dollar of lost output, the nation got $5 of stimulus. 5 to 1. That's not what you're supposed to do for a recession. Keynes is spinning in his grave, okay? This is not stimulus. This is absolute insanity. But they did it anyway. And the question here you have to ask yourself is, where'd they get that money? $6 trillion. Where do you come up with $6 trillion to borrow and spend? You got to remember, in 2019, all debt levels in the United States grew by $3.5 trillion. So all private and all public debt at state, federal, local levels, all debt grew by $3.5 trillion. If Congress had gone to the debt markets in 2020 and said, we need $3 trillion, they would have collapsed. Couldn't have managed that. Couldn't have gotten that money. But lucky for Congress, they didn't have to go to the bond markets. They only had to go to the Federal Reserve. You remember that formerly independent institution. Well, they showed up and they said, Jerome, we need some money. He said, no problem, okay? Quantitative easing, $5 trillion he pulled out for Congress. Now, quantitative easing isn't exactly new. We did it last time around. You remember Ben Bernanke did $3.5 trillion in quantitative easing in response to the Great Recession. But let's be clear the difference. Ben Bernanke did $3.5 trillion of quantitative easing over about 6 years in carefully calculated amounts. This guy did $5 trillion of quantitative easing over lunch in March, before we had one bit of data. And by the way, there's another important difference. We didn't need QE this time. What causes a depression? By the way, it's not a pandemic. What causes a depression is a combination of two things: a bad recession with deflation. Deflation, of course, is caused by a shrinking money supply. Time after time, whether it's the Great Depression or the Depression of the 1890s or depressions we've seen in Europe, over and over and over, when do you have a depression? It's, again, you have a bad recession combined with deflation. Well, when it came to the Great Recession, we had a really bad recession on our hand, and yes, we had deflationary pressures. The collapse of the subprime bubble was causing problems across the debt markets, and that is inherently deflationary. So we needed that money to keep things steady. This time around, there was no financial crisis. There were no bankruptcies. There were no foreclosures. There were no failed banks. There were no asset-backed securities going belly up. There was no problem, but he did it anyway. And of course, the response couldn't be more obvious. Just take a look at M2. This is a 3-year growth rate in M2. Ben Bernanke's $3.5 trillion of quantitative easing kept M2 growth moving at a nice, steady pace. This time around, Powell's $5 trillion of quantitative easing caused the single largest jump in money supply the nation has seen since we came off the Bretton Woods system. An insane jump in money supply. Now, what happens when you expand the money supply by 40% in about a year and a half? Well, again, not controversial, not rocket science. Another book at Amazon.com, Milton Friedman, 1983, Money Mischief. Check out those wonderful Jeffrey Dahmer sunglasses that were rocking it back in 1983, right? And of course, in this book, which costs $14, you don't even have to read the whole thing. First chapter lays her out, Jerome. It's all you had to read. You expand the money supply by 40%. Well, the first thing that kicks in is money illusion. Everybody feels rich. What do you do when you're rich? You invest and you spend. Interest rates go down. Asset prices go through the roof. Consumer spending picks up. Business investment takes off. It feels good. But here's the problem. The term here is illusion. You see, you got to remember something. In reality, money doesn't create wealth. Money is a system for redistributing wealth, but not wealth in itself. What's real wealth? Well, it's the ability to consume goods and services. And by the way, that's determined by the ability for the economy to produce those goods and services, which is a function of labor and skills and infrastructure and institution and laws and all those kind of good stuff. You can print all the money in the world, none of that changes. So what happens? Well, inevitably, what you have to recognize of all you've done is push demand beyond the capacity for the economy to meet that demand. Well, what happens when there's more demand than supply? Prices go up, right? Inflation, of course. Inflation kicks in, money illusion fades away, interest rates go up, and of course, asset prices settle down, consumer spending cools off, business investment cools off, and you end up exactly where you were, right? Nothing's changed. You didn't do a thing. Well, there are some long-run consequences. Two main ones. One problem, of course, is when you keep throwing money into the economy, you create investment risk. And that's bad for the economy in the long run. The other problem with inflation, it is inherently unequal. You create winners and losers. And even if the gains of the winners offset the losses of the losers, nevertheless, you have a big political problem on your hand. In general, what happens during inflation is that borrowers win and savers tend to lose. And if anybody knows anybody with a big portfolio of bonds, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So he calls this book Money Mischief because his argument is don't do it. You don't change anything about the economy fundamentally. All you do is create long-run problems. So do not do it. Well, guess what? We did it. And lo and behold, we had a big surge, of course, in household net worth. And yes, spending started taking off. We saw a big opening of the trade deficit. This isn't the first time this has happened, by the way. It's the third time. We had another big wealth bubble in the late 90s. That was .com. We had a big wealth bubble in the middle part of last decade. That was the subprime. This time, it's Jerome's wealth bubble. A little different and, by the way, less dangerous in as much as the last two the middle bubble was attached to a lot of debt. That's the worst kind of bubble. A debt-driven bubble is the scariest kind of bubble. A money-driven bubble, not so scary. Not that big of a deal as the case may be. One of the reasons for that, of course, is actually it's relatively progressive. One of the things that happened this time is when you look at the numbers, the way they fire hose money across the economy has largely benefited the bottom 50% of the pyramid. And that, of course, immediately turns into consumer spending at some level. So again, a different kind of cycle this time around. But of course, yes, you also had the big increase in prices, and interest rates have started to shoot up. Asset markets have started to respond. The stock market has come down. Not a lot. In fact, one of the interesting things, one of the things you got to keep in the back of your mind, sure, the stock market's down, and you have that neighbor who's complaining about his stock market portfolio. Oh, man, my stocks are down 20% from last year. The only thing you got to do is go, yeah, well, how are you doing relative to 19, Chief? No, oh, okay, that's pretty good, I guess, right? That's it. In fact, one of the surprising things about the equity markets is how little they have actually given back relative to the chaos of the last couple of years. The PE ratios in the stock market are still relatively high. You hear all about the tech bust because venture capital money fell. Yeah, venture capital money fell from the insane levels in 21 into a slightly lower level in 2022. I mean, even Bitcoin has started to resurge. I mean, again, Bitcoin, they got to 60,000, and then it collapsed to $20,000, which meant it was $20,000 to be at its fundamental value of zero, okay? I'm sorry. But was that unclear? If anybody's wondering, the fundamental value of Bitcoin it's zero, okay? And if you're wondering why, it's 5 letters, Ponzi. He's an Italian guy, lived 100 years ago. Look him up, okay? I'm not even going to have this argument. But even Bitcoin is starting to bounce back. So again, it's not as what you think it is. The real surprise in this economy, though, is actually the conversations we're having about this. Take Janet Yellen. Janet Yellen has a long career in macroeconomics. She's married to George Akerlof, who also has the Nobel Prize and writes books, by the way, with Robert Shiller. And they were all friends with Milton Friedman. So if anybody understands inflation, it's her, right? And then she gets up in front of a microphone in D.C. and she says, oh, we didn't expect these supply chain issues. What? Or, it's the federal deficit. Or it's, greedy corporations. Not enough manufacturing jobs. Green energy policies. It's rising wages. That's why we have inflation. Or, now everybody can agree. It's Putin's fault. It's Putin's fault. What are they going to come up with next? Oh, the Lakers' lack of a good guard. Oh, it's Taylor Swift is the problem. Or, I don't know, maybe it's because Elon Musk can't get it up. His rocket, that is, his rocket. You heard what happened this morning, right? What are we talking about? Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. This is the most common quote. You put in inflation is always in the internet, and it pops right up. It's a monetary phenomenon. Inflation is caused when you print too much money, period. Why are we having these bizarre debates? Well, I'll tell you why. Miserableism, that narrative thing. You got to remember in D.C., 75% of Americans are living hand to mouth. They're one paycheck away from homelessness. Their lives are squalid and terrible. And oh, by the way, it's all the fault of the other party's policies. Well, in that world, you can't stand up and say the truth. Why do we have inflation? Because people are spending too much money. Can't say that out loud. It's not allowed. But that's what's going on. And it's amazing how we can't talk about that. One of my favorite examples of this, last year, one of the big news stories was, of course, the increase in gas prices. From the beginning of last year to the middle of last year, gas prices went up by 50%. And I mean, yeah, okay, it costs a lot to fill up your pump, but the existential hand-wringing, just the pearl-clutching in the papers and the, oh, God, it's tragic, it's terrible, right? Okay, just back up just 1 second, all right? Okay, this is supposedly a supply shock, right? Well, look at the bars in the back there. That's vehicle miles driven. Go back to supply and demand. You remember that graph? If this is a big supply shock and prices go up by 50%, what should happen to vehicle miles driven? Anyone? Go down. What happened to vehicle miles driven last year? Not a damn thing. It didn't change. People just went about doing exactly what it was they wanted to do, like they didn't care. Oh, they cared, they complained about it, like this guy. You remember him? Then you remember the news guy will come up to him, they put a microphone in his face, and be like, hey man, how do you feel about filling up your truck? Oh, it sucks, man, I hate the Middle East. Biden's the worst. Whoa, thank you for those educated opinions. Back to you, Becky. What? Ask him the next question. Just ask him the next lobbyist question. Hey, where are you going, Chief? Oh, me and the boys are taking the boat out to the... But I thought you said gas was expensive. Yeah, we had to buy cheap beer. Hey, no worries, Gavin Newsom's got you covered. What are we doing? The problem in our world is people have too much money to spend, and our solution is to give them more money. What is going on? Absolute chaos. I mean, all the stories about how bad 2022 was because of inflation. Well, here's some evidence of it. This is how tragic it was. Look at those numbers. Record high gaming revenues in Vegas, record high spending on alcohol. People have been driven to drink and gamble, people. Did anybody see the traffic jams in Coachella last weekend? Did you see those? We're sitting around telling ourselves how tragic everything is, and there's 19 hours of traffic of 130,000 people want to party in the desert. Every VIP seat in that concert was taken up, people. Every single one. Concert tickets. Depeche Mode was playing in L.A. $2,400 a seat. No, I did not go. What is going on? And so we sit around and talk about how terrible it is. Look, last year was actually a good year for consumer spending. It was flat for goods. Services were up a lot. Well, of course, the pandemic's behind us. We're doing things we used to do. And you can see it here. Taxable sales are way above where they were in Fresno. Oh, they're topping out a bit, but only because people are running out of space in their garage. Look at restaurant spending. Restaurant spending is 40% above where it was pre-pandemic. 40% above. People are partying like crazy. And that's just true here. It's true here in Fresno as it is along the coast. I had some data, I forgot to put it in here. But actually, restaurant spending in the Central Valley has grown more than along the coast in the last 3 years. There's money everywhere, even with cars. Okay, they didn't have a good year for selling cars, but not because the dealers couldn't find a buyer. Quite the opposite. They couldn't find a car to sell. In a normal year, there's over 1 million units for sale. Right now in the United States, there's 110,000 cars for sale. 1/10 of what it normally is. It's the signs of demand are so palpable. But wait, I thought people were getting crushed by inflation. Story after story. Well, first a little context. A little context. We've had 1 year of inflation after 4 years of very low inflation. In fact, over the last 5 years, Americans have seen about an 18% increase in consumer prices. Contrast that to back in 1979, where after 5 years, there was 50% inflation. That's inflation, not this. Stop whining, millennials, please. This is not bad inflation. We haven't gotten there yet. We're not there. As for rising interest rates, most American debt is in the form of this wonderful product called the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. They don't care. Absolutely irrelevant to them. Now, the story for the pessimists who keep telling you the consumer's about to dry up will keep telling you, well, look, their incomes are being squeezed by inflation. The savings rates dropped to 2%. They can't go anymore. But this has nothing to do with incomes. It's wealth. Remember, this is a wealth bubble. And take a look at these numbers. Even with a little bit of give back in the stock market, households are still $30 trillion above where they were pre-pandemic. And that's not even a good metric because that includes stock market wealth. And stock market wealth doesn't have a big wealth effect. After all, a lot of your stock market wealth is sitting in your 401k. You're not going to touch it till you're 65, right? Or it's held by corporations, right? The really important thing actually is cash on hand. Look at this number on the right-hand side. This is household checkable deposits. Prior to the pandemic, all American households together were holding on to about $1.2 trillion of just cash on hand in their checking account and in their savings account. Right now, $4.5 trillion cash on hand, 3 times the cash balances they were at prior to the pandemic. Piles and piles of cash. Well, you say that's nice for Elon. No, it's not Elon. Again, go back to the idea that this has been a progressive bubble. In fact, the bottom 50% of Americans have seen a bigger increase in overall net worth. And by the way, they have seen just as big of an increase in overall cash on hand. This is a universal phenomenon. Americans across the board are doing great. And, you know, even when it comes to businesses, ask any business, what's your problem? Can you not find enough buyers? No, that's not my problem. I can't get enough people to work for me. Job openings rates are still incredibly high right now. Now, why do we have a lot of job openings? Well, part of it's the hot economy, and part of it, of course, has to do with the pandemic, and then another part of it has to do with the long-run forces of basic demographics. Now, let's just start with the demographics right off the top. This day was going to come. We knew that. Why? Boomers. Boomers all came out of families of 12 kids. They apparently were so scarred by that experience, they all had 1.2 kids, which they excessively overparented, giving us the millennials and Gen Z. So here we are. Now here's the problem. Now boomers are retiring, and every time a boomer retires, you get one Gen Z coming into the workforce, one, complaining, whining, hollering, quiet quitting the entire time. Quiet quitting, really? Quiet quitting. I'm an Xer, for God's sake. We invented slacking. Who are you? We were the first ones to live in our parents' basements, not you. But of course, it's the pandemic that really took things home, because during the pandemic, a couple million people retired. And suddenly, there's not enough people. Now, there are upsides and downsides to labor shortages. The upside, of course, is if you're worried about income inequality, your solution has arrived. You know, over the last 3 years, the bottom half of American workers have seen substantially higher growth rates in their earnings than the top 50%. Yes, the bottom 50% have more earnings growth than the top 50%. In smaller margins, that trend goes back to 2017. And if you didn't hear me, let me say it one more time. Income inequality in the United States has been falling since 2017. Falling. Has anybody seen that story in the New York Times? Anyone? Not allowed to say that out loud. Now, of course, here's the downside. If you're trying to run a business, the cost of your labor is going through a roof. Yeah, there's a lot of demand for businesses, but they'll tell you, I don't have enough people, and my labor costs are really high. It's tough to run the business in this kind of atmosphere, but that's because there's just not enough people. Now, again, the upsides are pretty clear, particularly in a place like the Central Valley, where there are more lower-skilled workers. We know about that. But the opportunities today are profound. Take a look at some of these numbers. Look at the share of people in these counties, in the Central Valley, Fresno, Sacramento, and Kern, that have a subprime credit score. You see those really high numbers coming out of the Great Recession. A lot of people got caught up in that nonsense with subprimes. It fell through the last cycle. And then in the last 3 years, it's absolutely plummeted to record low levels. People have some of the best credit scores ever. Look at weekly wages. 3 years ago, weekly wages in Fresno County were $800. Today, it's $1,000. In 3 years, average weekly wages have gone up 25%. Now you know why the restaurants here are so busy. There's a lot of spending power out there. And you also know why businesses are investing. They have to invest. When you don't have enough people, you have to buy equipment, computers, software. And of course, these sales are there to make up for the loss of people. But of course, we still have to listen to the narratives about how AI is coming to steal your job. Bring the AI on, people. We need it. Now, one of the big questions, of course, you're asking yourself, well, how far can this inflation thing go? The answer is we got a ways to go. It has everything to do with the amount of money in the system, and there's still a lot of money in the system. They grew the money supply by 40%, and by hook or by crook, that money's going to have to get absorbed largely through increases in prices. We're about halfway through it at this point in time, so we got a little ways to go because that money's sitting out there. This is a basic equilibrium between prices and the quantity of money, so about halfway. Now, the weird thing is, what has the Federal Reserve done about this? Well, the primary mechanism they've tried to use to slow down inflation is not quantitative tightening. That was a secondary thing they decided to do. They mainly used the federal funds rate, which is bizarre because the federal funds rate does not control the amount of money, at least not in a primary fashion. In fact, the only thing the federal funds rate does is change the pace of price adjustment, not the amount of price adjustment. If we have 8 to 15% more inflation to go, if the federal funds rate is at 1%, maybe that takes place over 2 years. If it's at 7%, maybe it takes place over 4. But you're not changing the ultimate destination. You're not. Ultimately, the amount of money will determine where inflation will go. Simple as that. What we will do, of course, by cranking up that short-run interest rate, was, you'll invert the yield curve. And you'll create some, of course, ripples in the overall economy. Now, look, the reason people get nervous and jerky about the yield curve is that precedes a lot of recessions. But you got to remember, an inverted yield curve is created largely by the Fed. So I have a little bit of a philosophical question for you, a couple of them actually. Something to think about later on, after we're done. Something we can mull about when we're having a drink after this at the cocktail reception, right? For example, does free will truly exist? I mean that sincerely. In a Newtonian world, do we really have control over ourselves? I don't know. It's very spooky. It's deep stuff. How about the fact, why is there a D in fridge but not refrigerator? Can someone explain this to me? I don't get this. And I should ask, by the way, does expecting the unexpected make the unexpected the expected? I don't know these things. But last but not least, if the Fed inverts the yield curve and the economy is otherwise fine, will it cause a recession? On this one, I'm a little unclear, I have to admit. And that, of course, goes back to what is going on in the banking system. Now, the other part, of course, of trying to fight inflation is quantitative tightening. And late last year, after increasing money supply by 40%, they started selling off bonds, and they took M2 down by a mere 4%. But it's that mere 4% that caused all the problems in the banking system. And let me explain what's going on with banking, what's going on particularly if you're going to try to get a loan, and it's a little hard. Let me explain to you what's going on. First of all, the bank is not worried about you, Mr. Borrower, okay, or Mrs. Borrower, as the case may be. Take a look at the left-hand side. This is loan delinquencies in the U.S. commercial banking system. And you can see in the middle of the Great Recession, those hit about 7%. An insane amount of debt problems in our banking system because some banks engage in, shall we say, some shady underwriting behavior. Not this time. Our commercial banks have been clean as a whistle over the last decade. The commercial bank delinquency rate in the fourth quarter of last year was 1.19% seasonally adjusted, the lowest it has ever been. The lowest it has ever been. That's not the problem with banks. This is not a conversation of bad debt. That is not why they're having a problem. Why are they having a problem? Well, what happens when the Federal Reserve throws $5 trillion at the economy? Well, no matter where it gets spent, if it's spent on rent or food or venture capital or on a 401k, no matter what you spend that money on, eventually, you know where it's going to land? In a bank. And lo and behold, $5 trillion of brand new cash turned into almost $5 trillion in deposits. Now, what is a bank supposed to do with all these deposits? What they want to do with it is loan it out, but you're not going to expand your loan base that quickly. There's not enough demand for this. So you do with that money exactly what the Federal Reserve tells you to do. You're supposed to buy super safe securities. You buy GSEs and treasuries and all that good stuff because that's what the Federal Reserve tells you to do. And it is safe stuff. In fact, the only thing that can happen to those value securities is if you know interest rates should suddenly shoot up from 0 to 5%. Aha! But even here, it's not that big of a deal because banks don't have to mark to market. In other words, they don't have to sell, it's not going to sell those bonds, they can just pretend they're full value. And so it's fine, it doesn't hurt their balance sheet. Nothing really happens. Unless, of course, the Fed starts quantitative tightening. Now understand what's going on. If quantitative easing will put money into the banks, inevitably quantitative tightening has to take it out of the banks. And lo and behold, think about what happened over the last 5 months in the banking system. Loans went up by 5%, deposits went down by 2.3%. Well, what are you going to do? You have to sell securities at a loss. Ding, ding, ding. This is the problem. They were made to buy all sorts of securities, and now they're being forced to sell those same securities at a loss. And you wonder why they're under pressure? Silicon Valley Bank, by the way, was the extreme version of this. Their deposits went from $80 billion to $180 billion in a year and a half. They put it in securities. Suddenly, deposits started to go down. They had to sell those securities. Boom! A run happened, and they went into default. By the way, were they actually technically default? We don't know. We actually don't know. It was a run. The bank could have actually made it through, but a run will panic a bank. And that kind of brings me back to what's going on with the Federal Reserve. They're acting out of hand. Hey, look, the Federal Reserve's jobs are very simple. Number one, price stability. Number two, full employment. Number three, be a good shepherd of the banking system. You got that? Full employment, price stability, shepherd of the banking system. Now, here's the key. Those goals don't necessarily line up. If you do one thing for one of those goals, you could put stress on another one of your goals. This is why the Federal Reserve is supposed to be filled with boring bankers and monetary economists, people you never want at a cocktail party, who are going to sit around and truly consider what's going on and the cost of benefits of reacting. That's not this Federal Reserve. Instead, this is a group of politicians who are violently reacting to narratives without thinking about what the hell the consequences of their choices are. Issue number one, in a complete, utter, ridiculous panic over full employment, they blew up price stability. And then in a ridiculous panic over price stability, they're undermining the banking system. And the net result of that, well, we're not sure yet. You know, what really gets interesting over the next 6 months is, where does Jerome go now? Now he's got a real problem on his hand. He has two choices. You fight inflation and you blow up the banking system. Or you back off the banking system and you let inflation run. From an economist standpoint, the latter is clearly the right option. From a politician standpoint, particularly a year and a half from an insanely contentious election, the other option is the way to go. So what are you going to do, Jerome? Which way are you going to turn? This is going to be the best movie in town. But in the meantime, yeah, credit's taking a hit. Go look at increasing standards on commercial real estate loans, C&I loans. Why is it tough to get a loan? Because it's expensive for the bank. They're not worried about default. They're worried about the cost of capital. It's a different kind of conversation. And yeah, it can be a little rough out there. So be prepared for a little bit of a capital crunch because of this particular issue. Which brings me, of course, to a story about commercial real estate. Look, cap rates in commercial real estate have been falling year after year after year. Interest rates just shot up. Well, that doesn't work. How do you work in a 3% cap, market with a 7% mortgage rate? That doesn't fly, particularly when you throw some capital constrictions in there. So you're starting to see some repricing problems, some stressors on the situation. But put that to one side, because if you look at the ground level, you see a completely different picture. In fact, look at the national non-residential construction spending, which has accelerated over the last year. Commercial real estate vacancies actually look pretty good outside, of course, one area, office. And even there, it hasn't. There's been a lot of panic points, but it's not that much higher. It was higher back during the course of the Great Recession. So we're in this panic zone, but the underlying numbers don't look bad. And by the way, here in the Central Valley, the numbers look amazing. Office vacancies have actually come down in Bakersfield, warehouse down across the board. Even retail vacancies are coming down here in the Fresno area. Good, steady numbers at the ground level. This is the oddity. We have the crisis in the banking system, but the ground level real estate is just fine. And even when you look at non-res real estate here in the county, it looks good. And of course, the big thing going on in the Central Valley right now is industrial. Is industrial a flash in the pan? Absolutely not. Hey, first of all, we know a lot of manufacturing coming back on board in the United States, but also more importantly, we just do things a little differently. This is one of my favorite statistics. Pitney Bowes has been collecting data on package delivery. Back in 2016, there were 11 billion packages delivered in the United States. In 2020, it was 20 billion. 2021, 21.6 billion packages, doubled in 5 years. And to be clear, that's 166 parcels per household per year. 166. I get that a month at my house. So there's a lot of room for expansion here, okay? So yeah, that's not changing. That's going to be a centerpiece of what's going on out here. As for housing itself, it's taken a big dive too. But again, it's not the Great Recession. Look, prices went through the roof. Take a look at some of these numbers. Tampa, in 2 years, median prices in Tampa, according to Case-Shiller, went up 64%. These aren't normal numbers. And now, of course, interest rates are going up. Suddenly, that house looks a lot more expensive from a borrowing perspective, and things are cooling off. But is it going to flatten? Of course not. First of all, this is not that housing cycle. That housing cycle went on for a number of years and was driven by subprime debt. This housing cycle went on for 2 years and was driven by cash. And cash is still king. A decade ago, there was $10 trillion of equity in the U.S. real estate market. Today, $30 trillion of equity, one of the lowest debt-to-equity ratios ever. The mortgage markets remain insanely clean. Again, there's no problems out there. Well, unless you're trying to buy a house, because what you'll really find, the real problem out there is no inventory. That's what's interesting. If you think about the housing market of 2010, it was a housing market that was, of course, dictated by a lack of buyers. This housing market is insanely cold because of a lack of sellers. There's no inventory. No one's going to move. And that's what I mean about the collapse in filtering. One of the things that makes me crazy about California, among many, is this term. And a lot of people say it, even people who mean well and they know better, and they come up to me and they go, yeah, Chris, we really have a shortage of affordable housing. No, we have a shortage of housing, which makes it unaffordable. It's different. You don't build affordable housing. No one builds affordable housing. You build nice housing, and that's okay. Because when you build housing, nice housing, these folks move here, these folks move here, these folks move here, these folks move here. That's the filtering process. You build at the top to supply at the bottom. You don't think that works? Think of the reverse. Go to the Bay Area where they stopped building. What happened? When they stopped building nice units, cherished working class neighborhoods were instantaneously gentrified. It's the exact opposite. So you build at the top to supply at the bottom. Well, here's the problem. That relies on people moving up. Who's going to move up right now? How many people out there have a 2.75% mortgage or getting ready to sell that to move to a nice house down the street with a 7% mortgage? Raise your hand. So filtering comes to, of course, a shrieking halt. We don't have enough housing. Suddenly, housing supply shortages become that much worse. And you can already see things starting to firm up. Home prices aren't falling. Inventories of homes for sale are actually relatively weak. The numbers suggest a housing market that, if anything, is just going to go flat until the fundamentals catch up where prices are now. But people are not capitulating. It's as simple as that. And that's one of the reasons why rental markets are so hot. All these people would love to get an owner-occupied, but there's no inventory, so they're stuck in apartments, and apartments are red hot. Rents are up, vacancy rates are down, just as true here in the Central Valley as anywhere else. And when you look at that cost of rent, I get it. A lot of people are freaking out about that big increase in cost of rent. But remember, that is being caused by increases in wages. Apartments are an incredibly competitive market. The only reason you see that kind of jump in rents is because people have demand for housing, and they have demand for housing because labor markets are incredibly tight. I showed you the data. Wages are up. Average weekly wages in Fresno have gone from $800 to $1,000 in 3 years. That's what's driving that rent. And that is one of the problems in California. Because we don't build enough housing, renters can't get ahead. Anytime a renter gets a little bit ahead in life, it just goes to the landlord because we don't build housing. It's as simple as that. You've got to build housing. And by the way, when we're talking about housing, let's talk about who's recovered and who hasn't. We've all heard the numbers. California, middle of the list. You know, we're not growing as fast as Arizona and Texas, but put all that to one side. Look, the reality is no matter where you look in this country, whether it's rural, whether it's urban, whether it's coastal, whether it's inland, whether it's red, whether it's blue, every part of this nation has help wanted signs. All right? There is simply not enough people, not enough workers anywhere in this nation right now. And that means that the conversation is no longer about workers or jobs. It's now about workers. Economic development has been completely flipped on its head. And when you think about California, the fact that we haven't been adding as much jobs as Texas, I get so exhausted by this debate. Oh, we're better than you. No, we're better than you. We grow faster. We grow better in this way. No, the difference between California and Texas is right there on the left-hand side. They build housing, we don't. Thus, they grow their population, and we don't. Ergo, they can grow their labor market, and we can't. And right now, California's housing vacancy rates have never been lower. And if you look across California, where do you see the bounce back? Well, it's in not the coastal economies, but it's not because the coastal economies are having a worse bounce back. Everybody's bouncing back. The difference is the coastal economies had a bunch of people who moved inland and a bunch of people retired. And as a result of that today, Stockton, the Inland Empire, Fresno, Sacramento, Bakersfield, these are the economies that have come roaring back. Fresno, 4.9% growth over the course of the last 3 years. Very solid numbers, driven by labor force availability. Good solid numbers here in the region. Jobs are up ahead of where they were. Things are moving great. Yet, do you ever hear about how well Fresno is doing? No. This narrative about the Central Valley, at least according to the folks in Sacramento, is the Central Valley is an economic backwater. It's a place that needs to be pitied and rescued from its own squalid existence. I'm exhausted by this. Yet again, you know, I've done a lot of work in the Central Valley over the years, and yes, it's a different kind of economy. I get it. Fresno doesn't look like San Jose. So what? That is not the metric of success. Do you have rising wages? Yes. Do you have tight labor markets? Yes. Are there job opportunities? Yes. And by the way, is there housing? Yes. This place has a lot going on. And by the way, when it comes to these conversations about economic growth, the Central Valley, from Sacramento down to the Inland Empire, is where it's at, because this is where there is available supply. This is where you're willing to build housing. This is a place that has opportunities. And indeed, this is the time you need population growth, because one of the things you're really going to start seeing over the course of the next couple of years is the bite of a lack of labor force. Fresno's unemployment rate has just dropped to the lowest it has ever been. Ever been. So suddenly, that available workforce is starting to dry up. And you need to think about, how do we continue this growth surge? Well, the answer, of course, is housing. But it's not just housing. You can build housing, but will they come? In my perspective, a lot of this has to do with a change in the narrative. You know? Again, there's too much conversation about the inland parts of California somehow or other being economic problems. They're not. They're healthy, growing economies. You put these economies in any part of the nation, and they'd be heralded as some of the best economies in that state. But here we have this weird reaction, and we need to get off that. Look, labor shortages are a huge problem in the state of California, across this nation. We have the opportunity of saying, build it and they will come. So when you think about how do you get through the next couple of years, you know, it's again, increase your labor force, build housing supply, but more important, understand to attract people here. It's about schools, it's about parks, it's about downtowns, it's about restaurants. It's about providing a standard of living and then advertising that. Getting away from this ridiculous narrative, talking about the upsides of living in Fresno and the economic opportunities it offers. It's a different kind of conversation. It's not housing costs, it's housing supply that's the center of this whole thing. Simple as that. Now, if I had to all sum it up, where are we? Well, the expansion is going to continue, except for, of course, depending on what the Federal Reserve decides to do. Wealth and income will drive consumer spending, business spending to offset labor shortages. Sure, asset values are going to fall, but the fundamentals of the assets are going to be just fine. Banks, yeah, there's going to be some issues in those credit markets, but remember, the issues are up here. But down here, things look great because of all that cash, $4.5 trillion in cash sitting in checking accounts. As for the inland economies, they're bouncing back, huge potential, labor force, residents' incomes are growing. You're getting an overall core level of demand. That's why restaurants are busy and the retail shops are busy here. And that's not going anywhere. This change is going to stay in place. Labor markets are flipped, and that's going to be enormously beneficial to the inland empire. I'm sorry, the inland part of the economy. Real estate, you got to build more. And yes, there's a lack of liquidity, but that's okay. Build multifamily. Huge demand for that. And that, by the way, is an enormous step forward. Multifamily is a key part of growth across the state. We don't build enough multifamily anywhere in this state. As for the potential scenarios, well, again, it's Jerome's choice. What is he going to do? Is he going to bend and fight inflation and cause a banking crisis that could create a recession? Or is he going to back off and just let inflation burn itself out? Because it will. And the answer is, yeah, you got to burn it out. But will he do it? I don't know. We got issues at the federal level. We got this debt ceiling coming up. We got global situation with China and of course, Russian aggression. But of course, the thing that scares me more than anything else is where I started this whole conversation today, the narrative. How many narratives out there are absolutely broken? And yet, as opposed to trying to fix that narrative, we continue to roll forward with the same old dismal narratives that aren't helping us improve the actual ground level situation. You know, Mark Twain, it's easier to fool people than it is to convince them that they have been fooled. By the way, I never actually said that. But he said something very close to it, so it's okay. Actually, I like JFK maybe a little better. And this one he did say, the great enemy of the truth is often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. You know, one thing I want you to think about, it's easy to point a finger at politicians and mock them for these narratives they tell us. But how do politicians get elected? There is the rare politician who can truly stand up and tell his or her own narrative. Winston Churchill and FDR, right? These are people who can stand up and tell their own narrative. They can change, they can move the ship, right? They can turn the ship. Most politicians aren't that. Most politicians win or die, win or lose that election on the basis of grabbing the right narrative. If they're chasing a narrative, it's because we're okay with that narrative. And if we want a different narrative to be in Sacramento, a different narrative to be in Washington, D.C., well, we have to choose that. We have to start by telling the real narrative. We have to stand up and say, no, that's not true. Here's the underlying facts. Here's the real story. And that's not something you're going to do overnight. That has to be a consistent process in these regions. I mean, this is one of the regions that economic development corporations exist. Part of what they have to do is define the narrative. Because if you don't define it, who is? So avoid the weapons of mass distraction. Have a good year. Don't panic. And here's your QR code. Thank you very much.